In the cities of the 17th century, the nights belonged to the flame. Candles flickered in narrow windows, casting trembling halos across crooked streets. The air was thick with soot, the smell of tallow, and the slow breath of the forgotten. Beneath that wavering light moved the unseen women of the age, mothers, widows, strangers, fighting to exist in a world that had little space for them. They were born into an age of collapse and rebuilding. Europe was still trembling from the weight of plague, the scars of religious wars, and the endless churn of empires. The powerful wrote treaties. The powerless wrote survival. And in that unwritten script, women filled the margins, forgotten by historians, but never by the streets. By day, these streets were filled with merchants and soldiers. By night, they belonged to whispers, to those who sold not their virtue, but their endurance. The taverns were crowded with noise and smoke. The alleys hummed with quiet negotiation. No one called them workers. Few called them women. They were ghosts with heartbeat and hunger. Behind every closed door, another story breathed. Some washed linens for the inns. Some stitched coats for soldiers who would never return. Others bartered companionship, warmth, or shelter. Because in a century where money was scarce, survival had its own currency. And though history gave them no name, their labor built the foundations of cities. This was a century that feared women almost as much as it needed them. In sermons and pamphlets, they were blamed for sin, temptation, or decay. But on the cobblestones, their work fed the poor, clothed the armies, and kept the taverns alive. Between the church bell and the curfew, they carried the weight of empires, unseen, unpaid, unpraised. In the flicker of candlelight, a truth shimmered, that even in the darkest corners, humanity persisted. The women of these streets were neither saints nor sinners. They were survivors, shaping a world that never intended to remember them. But the streets remembered. The walls kept their whispers. And centuries later, their shadows still dance beneath the flame.
The 17th century was an age of unending conflict, a Europe scarred by fire and faith. From the 30 Years' War to the English Civil War, from revolts in Flanders to the endless sieges in the German states, the land itself seemed to groan under the weight of armies. Villages were plundered, harvests burned, and rivers ran black with ash. Behind every marching battalion trailed not just soldiers, but refugees, the wives, mothers, and daughters who followed destruction in its wake. For them, war was not fought with swords, but with hunger. Every border shifted, every victory carved new widows into the soil. The treaties signed by kings meant little to those left standing in the smoke. And when the soldiers finally moved on, it was the women who sifted through the ruins, who buried the dead, gathered the ashes, and tried to stitch life back together from whatever scraps remained. Decades of fighting created a world where the absence of men became the defining silence. Entire villages lost their working hands, their farmers, their craftsmen. Letters stopped arriving, and names faded from memory as wars swallowed husbands, sons, and fathers. For many women, there was no news, only waiting. Waiting until waiting became the only thing left to do. Without men, families lost not only their strength, but their legal identity. A woman without a husband was not simply alone. She was invisible in the eyes of the law. Property, trade, even the right to work openly were bound to a male guardian. And so the women of the 1600s learned to live without permission. They became their own protectors, their own laborers, their own unacknowledged heads of households. The church bells still rang, but the prayers were whispered by different voices. Women who had learned that mourning could not feed a child, and grief could not rebuild a home. When war burned the countryside, migration became a form of endurance. Women gathered what little they could carry, a blanket, a loaf of bread, a memory, and walked. Roads filled with travelers who were neither soldiers nor merchants, but the displaced, the unwanted, the hungry. They moved toward cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam, drawn by rumor and necessity. Every mile was a bargain between danger and hope. Children were carried until arms gave out. Elders were left behind in chapels and barns. The journey itself became a kind of test, of faith, of strength, of silence. Many never reached the cities they sought. Others arrived only to find that the gates were closed. The sound of boots on the road was no longer the march of armies, but of women seeking a place that might let them live. The map of Europe changed, not only in borders and kingdoms, but in footsteps, glimmered in the imagination like salvation. But behind their stone walls waited another kind of struggle. The streets were overcrowded, filled with refugees from 100 villages. Guilds refused to hire outsiders. Local charities turned away anyone without a parish record. Women who arrived at the gates found themselves on the edge of a system that did not recognize them. Many took the lowest work available: laundresses, maids, cooks in alehouses, seamstresses in the cold light of dawn. They scrubbed, stitched, and served until their hands cracked. But wages were meager, and rent consumed what little they earned. In the maze of alleys and taverns, the city's pulse was not in its palaces, but in its cellars, where survival was bartered hour by hour. For some, necessity turned them toward the night economies, the taverns, the theaters, the spaces where coins and company exchanged hands in shadows. These were not dens of sin, but of sustenance. Every whispered negotiation was a way to stay alive one more night in a world that offered no mercy. In a society built on lineage and property, those without family or trade had no place. A woman without a name, a husband, or a home became an exile in her own city. Her body, once a vessel of judgment, became a means of passage. It was not lust that shaped this world, but hunger, a bowl of stew, a warm bed, a coin for medicine. These were the prices of survival. Behind the laughter of taverns and the glow of candlelight, there was an unspoken understanding. Necessity was not sin, but a kind of rebellion. To live without permission, to sell one's endurance rather than perish quietly. This, too, was courage. Society watched these women from the safety of sermons and gossip, condemning the very economy it relied upon. Because while cities thrived on labor, much of that labor came from those deemed unworthy of respect. Every alley had its own market, every shadow its own rules, and within them lived the invisible architects of the urban night. Migration left its mark not only on the land, but on identity itself. Families were scattered, dialects blurred, and memories faded like smoke over the rooftops. Women took new names to escape old judgments, blending into the endless gray of the working class. They became the city's heartbeat, unseen, uncounted, but vital. Among the displaced, new bonds formed. They shared bread, secrets, and warnings. When one fell sick, another watched her children. In a world that had erased their pasts, they built small, fragile communities from the threads of shared survival. They called each other sister, not from blood, but from necessity. Religion loomed over every life in the 1600s. The church was both sanctuary and judge. Sermons preached mercy, but charity came only to those deemed pure. A woman without a husband was often seen as dangerous. One who earned her living outside the approved trades was labeled sinful. And yet, faith persisted in quiet forms, not in sermons, but in gestures. A candle lit for a missing child, a loaf of bread left at a neighbor's door, a whispered prayer before dawn. In the poorest quarters, women practiced a different kind of religion, not one of guilt, but of endurance. Their prayers were actions. Their hymns were survival. War and poverty had done more than destroy houses. They had dismantled the very idea of home. The hearth, once sacred, became transient. A rented attic, a tavern corner, a shared blanket in a cellar. These became the new domestic spaces. Home was no longer a place, but a condition. To be alive, to be sheltered, to be unseen. The domestic ideal that society praised, the quiet wife, the obedient mother, had no meaning for women who had lost everything. They created new definitions of family and belonging in the shadows, building small sanctuaries where none existed before. Their resilience redefined survival itself. And though history rarely spoke their names, the cities that rose in the centuries after carried their fingerprints. In the walls they scrubbed, the children they raised, and the lives they rebuilt from ashes. War did not only take lives, it took the meaning of home. In the echo of collapsing walls and the silence after gunfire, women learned to move forward without certainty. They carried not banners or swords, but the quieter tools of endurance, cloth, bread, and faith. They rebuilt what the world destroyed, and when history looked away, they kept living anyway. Their footsteps crossed the roads of Europe. Their hands built the foundations of cities that would forget their names. But in every alley where candlelight still trembles against the stone, a trace of their courage remains, the echo of women who refused to disappear. The streets of the 1600s were more than mud and misery. They were markets of survival. Every alley, every courtyard, every corner of candlelight held a quiet transaction, not always of coin, but of endurance. When the law closed its doors to women, the streets opened their arms, rough, cold, and unkind. Here, women built an invisible economy, one born not from greed but from hunger. It was called sin by the preachers, scandal by the wealthy, but for those who lived it, it was simply life. The wars had ended, but peace did not feed the poor. Cities were swollen with refugees and widows, their names unrecorded, their wages unpaid. No laws protected women who worked without a master, and guilds forbade them from learning trades. So they invented their own markets, small, unseen, and fiercely practical. A woman could turn a pot of ale into a living. She could sell warmth by the hearth, sing for travelers, wash soldiers' shirts, or carry messages no man dared to deliver. These were not the markets of gold or power. They were the markets of breath and bread. Every coin earned meant another night. With a roof overhead, another day alive. The tavern and the threshold taverns became the centers of this hidden world. By day, they echoed with the clatter of mugs and boots. By night, they softened into places of whispers and survival. Women found refuge in these smoky rooms, trading song for supper or tending to travelers too drunk to stand. Behind the laughter and music, the tavern was a fortress of the forgotten. It offered warmth when the church offered judgment. Here, the ale seller and the washerwoman stood side by side, bound not by trade, but by endurance. A smile, a story, a song. Each became a currency. And though the lawmen called them fallen, they were in truth the ones who kept the city standing. At dawn, before the bells rang, the washerwomen began their work. Their hands cracked and bled in the cold river water, scrubbing away the stains of other people's lives. They stood knee-deep in freezing currents, surrounded by mist, their laughter echoing like church hymns. Each piece of linen they cleaned carried the scent of the wealthy, perfume, smoke, and sin. But in their world, the river was the great equalizer. No matter who wore the clothes, they all came here to be made clean. For a few coins, these women kept the city from drowning in its own filth. They earned little, but they earned it honestly, in the rhythm of washing, wringing, and surviving. As dusk fell, another economy stirred to life. Jugglers, singers, storytellers, women who turned their voices into sustenance. In market squares and under archways, they drew small crowds of sailors and servants, trading wonder for pennies. They told stories of lost kings, cursed lovers, and the ghosts that walked the old streets. But hidden between their words was truth. Stories of hunger, of women who refused to disappear. Their laughter masked pain, their costumes hid poverty, and their songs bought them another day of existence. The street became their stage and survival their only art. Society watched them with suspicion, labeling them with words soaked in shame, but the truth was simpler and more human. Many women who turned to night work or companionship did so not for pleasure, but for protection. A man's coin could mean a meal. A man's favor could mean safety from the cold, or worse, from other men. In a world ruled by property and purity, the body became the last thing a woman truly owned, and sometimes it was the only thing she could trade to stay alive. To historians, their lives became footnotes. To the preachers, they were sinners. But in the flicker of their candles, they were simply people trying to survive a century that gave them no choice. Despite the harshness of the streets, the women did not stand alone. They formed quiet alliances, sharing food, warning each other of patrols, protecting one another from danger. In these unspoken sisterhoods, kindness replaced law. An alewife might hide a runaway girl behind her bar. A laundress might share her night's bread with a performer who earned nothing that day. In the silence of the back rooms, they built what society refused to give them: community. The world saw only the scandal, but beneath it all, they were building the foundations of mutual care, fragile, invisible, and powerful. The price of survival was high. To exist outside the rules meant constant risk of punishment, disease, or death. Yet even when caught or cast out, these women returned to the streets with quiet defiance. They refused to vanish. They refused to let shame define them. Their lives were painted over by history, but if you listen closely to the songs that survived, the letters that escaped the fire, you can still hear them whispering through time. We worked. We lived. We endured. They called it sin. We might call it survival. In the alleys of empire and under the glow of tavern light, women created an invisible economy, not for wealth, but for existence. Their market had no banners, no coins of pride, only breath, warmth, and the courage to live another day. In the narrow alleys of the 17th century, judgment was everywhere, not just from the pulpit, but from the streets themselves. The same men who sought these women's company by night condemned them by morning. Authorities called it moral order. City guards patrolled taverns and alleyways, dragging women into jails for vagrancy. Religious courts gathered lists of names, not of the men who paid, but of the women who survived. Public punishment was met to shame. Heads shaved, faces branded, bodies marched through the square. Yet behind closed doors, the wealthy and powerful whispered protection, keeping their own secret safe while condemning others to ruin. The brothel raids, the sermons, the moral laws, they weren't about purity. They were about control. The women weren't sinners. They were scapegoats, punished for surviving the system that made them necessary. And in every trial, every whispered accusation, the double standard stood unbroken. Men sinned in silence, while women carried the burden of their desires for all to see. The women of the 1600s vanished from the records, but not from history. Their names were erased, yet their footsteps shaped the very streets we walk today. They washed the linens, brewed the ale, soothed the wounded, and raised the children who would become merchants, sailors, and rulers. Their labor built the rhythm of the city, unseen, unthanked, but essential. When night fell and the alleys went quiet, their whispers lingered, stories of endurance, laughter, and survival that no decree could silence. Today, their spirits live in the candlelight of old taverns, in the warmth of kitchen fires, in every woman who endures quietly yet fiercely. They were never saints. They were never villains. They were survivors, and their flame still burns, steady and unseen, in the heart of every forgotten street.